Okay, this is episode or segment 2 for Tuesday. We're picking up with the end of the civil rights movement. Wanted to mention when the feds mandate that desegregation occurs, it's usually mandated through busing, and the idea is to bus children to different schools to create desegregation. The truth was that most of the time the people who were bused were African American students who were bused to majority Anglo schools. But the other truth is that many Anglo parents who did not want their children to be part of this either left by moving into the suburbs, which were not forced to mix with the city school districts, or they put their children in private schools. And this phenomenon, which meant that a lot of white families left many of the cities, especially first in the South, and then as the desegregation moves north, up into the north, to the point where it was in the 1980s in Boston that they actually had some rioting over this issue. But what occurs is something called white flight. So, as I mentioned in the previous episode, between 1970 and 73, over 50% of the Anglo school children disappeared from the Dallas Independent School District, and the numbers were comparable in Atlanta and many other cities. And as a consequence, cities lose more of their tax base. But what we can say overall about the civil rights movement was that overall African Americans made strides in education and public office, but true economic gains were limited, at least at that time. Now we move to the youth revolt, which of course will eventually be focused on the war and the anti-war movement. It's, as we talked about the other day, there's always some people within each generation who aren't happy with things, but when the baby boom does anything, it's going to be amplified. By 64, there were more 17-year-olds than any other age. Disillusionment that they had in general about their feeling that the older generation was holding back potential changes and potential success that could occur was amplified and focused on the Vietnam War and, of course, the draft forcing young men into the military. Part of this movement was the idea that the establishment was holding everything back, and the view was to be anti-establishment. The very most radical were true hippies and leftists. These were true believers to the cause that they had to just leave society, but this was really only about 2 to 3% of college-age Americans. Other people sort of pretended at being hippies and leftists, but the true ones who took off and just abandoned society were really just about 2 to 3%. Another thing to keep in mind is that the power of the youth movement and the power of the baby boomers was seen when the 26th Amendment was passed in record time, and that was the amendment that lowered the voting age from 21 to 18. And the argument being, if you can fight and die in Vietnam, you surely should be able to vote in the United States. But showing the power of this voting bloc and their influence on the culture. As a side note, 1968 is actually the most tumultuous year of this entire period. January 31st, we have the Tet Offensive, which we'll be talking about in Vietnam. It's the turning point of the war. March 31st, as a result of the Tet Offensive and just total frustration over his inability to win the war, LBJ gave a speech saying he would not run for re-election in 1968, although he could have. On March 4th, Martin Luther King is assassinated in Memphis. On June 5th, Robert F. Kennedy is assassinated after he wins the California primary and looked to be a pretty solid choice, or pretty good chance that he would be the Democratic nominee for the presidency in 1968. So both John F. Kennedy and Robert F. Kennedy are assassinated. August 30th, when the Democrats hold their nominating convention in Chicago, the anti-war movement targeted that convention, and as they marched on the convention, there was what some people later described as a police riot. The protesters are being beaten by the police as the protesters are trying to march towards the convention hall, and as they are marching, they're chanting, "The whole world's watching, the whole world's watching," as people watch live on TV as all of this takes place. It makes the Democrats look very bad. So the situation outside the convention was very chaotic, and the situation in the convention wasn't any better, as they were arguing over everything, and really the party was splitting dramatically in many different ways. Part of the reason that the Republicans managed to gain power in 1968 or through that election and Nixon is able to win is because the Democrats look so bad. In October, showing their support for the Black Power movement, sprinters who win the gold and bronze medal. Actually, I think the first 3 places in the 100 meters, I believe, raise their hands in Black Power fist in the Mexico City Olympics, which scares white America quite a bit. They're forced to give up their Olympic medals, but are reinstated about 30 years later. And in November, Nixon defeats Humphrey, which was a pretty big change, especially with Nixon coming back from the political graveyard. The second movement we'll look at, or actually the third movement we'll look at here, is the women's liberation movement. And this is an interesting one in that it's a strong push for a change in society's view of the role of women. Although we talked about how it was bubbling up from the 1950s already, the book that was really behind this was a book called The Feminine Mystique, written by a woman named Betty Friedan in 1965, and it assaulted the idea that women are just moms and married to a house, and that image. The National Organization of Women, as it was known then in 1966, is formed, and from the book itself, which argued that, and I think we've talked about this before, it argued that women were kept in a second-class role in society by being forced to take care of children, and the idea being that because they're either taking care of kids or they're often pregnant, they really don't have an opportunity to compete against men on any kind of a level playing field. And so when NOW was formed in 1966, their big push was to aim at women in general, but not also men, but definitely the women who didn't really see their movement as something they wanted to be part of, through something they called consciousness raising. So they would protest and bring up the issues where women weren't treated equally in order for society to focus on them. Now, the other thing that, of course, they will focus on is the idea of birth control, through the argument that a woman should have control of her own body, since it's, as they might have described it, the enslavement of a woman as she has children and has to take care of a home that was in a sense caused by men because they didn't allow women to control their reproductive system. We have the push for birth control pills, and of course the push for abortion, both of which come to fruition either in the 60s or early 1970s. Of course, 73 Roe versus Wade decision. There's another sexual revolution. Once again, these are usually connected to a time when women are trying to change their status. But it was more than an argument over sexuality. It was a demand that male monopolies be broken in government, business, and generally in society. The results are that by the mid-1970s, there are quotas for women in just about every scenario in society. Now, a quota doesn't really mean that there's total equality. It just means that there are some spots set aside for women so that people can say, yes, I'm pushing for equality. And affirmative action, which was passed by Richard Nixon, will actually push that to some extent. Divorce becomes easier to obtain. One of the arguments that the women's movement had made was that because divorce was difficult to gain, that women were stuck in marriages that kept them from being capable or having the opportunity to be equal in society. The pill definitely changes family structure when children are born, all kinds of other behaviors. And then finally, one of the outcomes of this that some people point out was that women ended up, yes, having the opportunity to be equal, but also because of society's view on things, still were considered to be required to be in charge of the home, so they had to be somewhat of a supermom. Now, some other protest movements that get less publicity. Hispanic Americans pushed for equality in pay and representation and changes in immigration policy. Probably the most famous of these activists was a man by the name of Cesar Chavez, who was representing and pushing hard for migrant workers in California and in the Southwest. Eventually, organizations like La Raza and LULAC are formed in order to push the equality for Hispanic Americans. They're still very active, of course. Native Americans also push for equality and a different approach to their treatment. The American Indian Movement, or AIM, pops up. Sometimes there's a little bit of violence involved here, such as the siege of Wounded Knee, South Dakota in 1973. We had discussed at the end of our look at the West prior to the 20th century that the last time that the Native Americans really had any kind of military dispute against the United States was a bit of a slaughter by the military of Indians at Wounded Knee, South Dakota. Well, in 1973, a couple of men, Russell Means and Leonard Piltier, led a movement where they took over that area and killed some FBI agents, and it became a symbol for the movement to try and create more equality for Native Americans. And finally, for gay rights, there was a riot in 1969 near a bar called the Stonewall in New York City, or in Greenwich Village, and that riot is seen by many people today as the kicking off of the gay rights movement. The riot itself was based on difficulty with gay activists and the police, so it's seen as sort of the beginning of that movement. 1968 election, Nixon returns, and you can see here that it's interesting, but the South is definitely split at this point. Probably one of the more famous third-party candidates in the 20th century was a man by the name of George Wallace, who ran on a campaign of keeping segregation and telling the federal government to stay out of the business of the states. And you can see he won quite a bit of the Deep South, and in fact, if he had not run and those states had gone ahead and voted for the Democratic Party, which they normally do, it might have made enough of a difference to get Humphrey the election and keep Nixon from being elected at that point. Wallace was actually shot, although he lived after that, but he was shot and paralyzed while he was campaigning. Vietnam we're actually going to talk about in class, so I'm going to skip over this other than to say that it has a huge impact on the country, and when it's over, there's sort of a sour sense by many people about how we spent so much time, money, treasure, and especially lives trying to stop the spread of communism and didn't really seem to have any success. It also prompts a lot of protesting and all kinds of other issues that we'll talk about in class. When Nixon takes over, one of the things he has to deal with is his secret plan that he had talked about during campaigning to get us out of Vietnam, which turned out to be something that had already been brought up earlier by Lyndon Johnson, and that was the idea of slowly turning the war over to the South Vietnamese and getting out. It takes time for him to do that, and so there is a response, the Kent State riot, and we'll talk about that. Most of the stuff you see there at the top deals with Vietnam, so we'll hold off on that and talk about it in class. But in January of 1973, Nixon declares peace with honor. There's a peace treaty signed with North Vietnam. They pledge to leave South Vietnam alone, but of course as soon as we're gone, they don't. The other thing that's important, at least in a symbolic way, is that part of that treaty, as the U.S. left, was the freeing of the American hostages, or American soldiers who were prisoners of war, including John McCain, who will run for president later, who had been in what was known as the Hanoi Hilton for many, many years. But Nixon will declare peace with honor, although it really wasn't a peace with true honor. In 1972, Nixon will run for re-election, and he will defeat George McGovern, a very liberal Democratic candidate who probably has one of the worst losses in the history of presidential politics to Nixon. The irony is that in his fear of not being reelected and sort of his own personal paranoia, Nixon had actually done all kinds of, or ordered all kinds of covert operations against his opponents. One of them was to send his operatives from the Committee to Re-elect the President of the United States, or CREEP, to go to the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee in the Watergate Hotel and office complex, and to bug their phones. Now, they had already been bugged, but the bugs had given out, so they were on their way back in to fix those when they were caught. And that led to the entire Watergate mess that eventually causes Nixon to do something no president had ever done before, and that was to actually resign from office in August of 1970.